Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I am very pleased to rise and speak to this piece of legislation before the House today, Family Assistance and Child Support Legislation Amendment Protecting Children Bill of 2017. This bill effectively gives effect to two distinct measures that were announced in the 2017 budget. The first one being around some of the new arrangements pertaining to the No Jab, No Pay, Healthy Start for School, and the other component relates to, well, indeed gives effect to the government's response to a 2015 report that was presented to this parliament following an inquiry held by the Social Policy and Legal Affairs Committee. I was Labor's Deputy Chair during that inquiry, and indeed that report was from conflict to cooperation that was lodged. That was back in 2015, so I am delighted that now, in 2018, 3 years down the track, we have at least the beginnings of a response to some of the recommendations that were put forward during that very important inquiry into the child support payment system in Australia. I think just firstly, in relation to the part of this bill relating to No Jab, No Pay, I think it's important just at the outset to state very clearly that Labor has long supported this approach, and certainly we have no concerns regarding that component of the legislation, as indeed the majority of the recommendations around child support that appear in the Schedule 1 of the bill here. We do, and I will come back to this point in more detail after discussing the No Jab, No Pay component, but we do certainly share concerns. Indeed, the Shadow Minister and the member for Jagga Jagga earlier articulated Labor's concerns around the changes relating to amended tax assessments and potential overpayments. Really, the basis of that concern is that the child support recipients who have received those child support payments in completely good faith will have already expended those monies in caring for their children. And so it is very likely that there could be an unexpected debt owing, a debt that would arise for those parents, having, as I said, already expended that money and completely having received it in good faith and expended it on the care of their children. So that is an issue of concern, and as the member for Jagga Jagga made clear earlier on in this debate, that is an issue that we have taken up directly with both the former minister and indeed the current minister. We're awaiting further advice from the minister around our concerns, so we would reserve our final position there, including whether or not we would seek amendments in the Senate with this regard. But we are seeking further information on the potential impact of those changes. There are, as I said, some genuine concerns. We just need to have the government's position clarified there and indeed make sure that those potential impacts are well known and so that we are making well-informed decisions on this legislation now. But I will turn now to that first component of the bill around the No Jab, No Pay. As I said, Labor has absolutely no concerns about lending our support to this component of the bill. We certainly believe that every child in Australia deserves the best start in life possible, and we know and indeed support every effort in this place to better strengthen the immunisation rates in Australia. We on this side of the House absolutely back in the science in this regard. We have spoken out very loudly on many occasions when there have been some in this House and indeed the other who have been tempted to be critical of the issue around vaccinations and the good with which they serve in our community. And we've made very clear on each and every occasion that when it comes to vaccinations, we will always back in the science around the need to have high immunisation rates in Australia. And, you know, in government, Labor have made some important moves around the changes to family tax benefits that were designed to increase immunisation rates, and we indeed went to the 2013 election with some additional amendments there. And so the principles on which the current no jab, no pay policy are based have in fact enjoyed bipartisan support in this parliament for many, many years. And I think that we should remain very strong advocates, and I'm certainly pleased to see members opposite have shared this concern around the temptation that some people in the community have to get a bit lax on this or to start questioning the science around vaccinations. Certainly we know that the legislation before us now, in terms of the tightening up of some of the efforts to increase immunisation, go to an amount. The legislation is proposing to withhold an amount of $28 a fortnight from the Family Tax Benefit Part A to those families that don't meet the immunisation requirements. So that's really the fundamental change in this legislation. So the reduction in family tax benefits on a regular fortnightly basis would in fact replace the current system where you withhold the end-of-year tax supplement. And really effectively, I mean, the change in this legislation is necessary because we no longer, the abandonment of the end-of-year supplement has really necessitated a change in legislation to deal with the fact that the supplement no longer is there. So it's also necessary as families earning more than $80,000 a year are no longer eligible to receive that end-of-year supplement. That's really the main point I wish to make here, is that for those families earning more than $80,000 a year, this amendment is absolutely necessary in order to ensure that they too are feeling the the need to ensure that their children are indeed well covered and vaccinated as well. We know that vaccination remains the very best means we have to halt the spread of infectious diseases in Australia and to keep Australians healthy. We have strong immunisation rates here in Australia, and that has contributed to the eradication of many infectious diseases over time. And some children's vaccines were introduced in Australia as far back as 1932, and the deaths we've managed to decrease, deaths from vaccine-preventable diseases, have fallen by 99% since the introduction of vaccines. So no qualms from this side of the House in terms of the need to ensure that we have high rates of immunisation. We understand the science. We sort of understand the issues around herd immunity, and indeed we know that one of the most effective means of ensuring that everybody hears that message loud and clear from this parliament is to make these necessary changes now, so that the no jab, no pay changes will kick in, I understand, on the 1st of July. So no room for complacency on this issue, and we on this side of the House are very happy to back it in. I will just touch finally on some of the matters that came before the committee during the inquiry into the child support program. Indeed, there were 25 recommendations that the committee raised and have put to the government. Regretfully, this legislation looks at 3 of those recommendations, and whilst I certainly welcome some of those, the government finally belatedly acknowledging some of those required changes. As I said at the beginning, there are some concerns that we still have around some possible unintended consequences to those changes. I guess the first component that I'd really like to just look at is the proposed changes to the length of interim care payments and periods. So certainly this part of Part 1 of the schedule really relates to those changes seeking to deal with the fact that the amount of that there can be fundamental discrepancies at times between parents who express, there is a level of actual care that is going on within some of these families, and then there are some care arrangements that are also in place, which may or may not reflect the actual care being given. And disputes about care arrangements are indeed rife in the disputes more broadly amongst the child support system. But disputes about care arrangements are generally resolved by family law courts until this proposition, the Child Support Agency, for example, has not been able to enforce care arrangements. And certainly the inquiry received lots and lots of evidence around the discrepancies, as I said, between actual care provided and agreed care arrangements. Having said that, I would just like to put on the record again that the child support system in Australia, which today reaches, involves some 1.3 million parents and a payment system that's reaching some 1.1 million children in Australia, is a remarkable system in many ways. But we are dealing very often in these cases that this legislation is seeking to address with people who are caught in sometimes years of entrenched conflict and dealing with very complex issues and sometimes trauma and indeed very vulnerable families. That's the nature of a lot of family law in Australia. So these proposed changes to the length of interim care periods is one attempt to seek to address the issue that the 14 weeks which is currently in place in terms of, there is an arrangement that generally runs for this interim period of about 14 weeks, can in special circumstances be extended, but that period of time is generally not enough time for disputing parents to resolve their differences and indeed get a just and fair outcome in a 14-week period. I think anybody who has had experience of the family law system in Australia would understand that. So I think that the recommendations here in terms of those changes to interim care are worthwhile. I think I would just flag that currently there is still an exemption from participating in dispute resolution processes for those people who are experiencing domestic and family violence. I would put on notice here that I believe the government is seeking to change that component. Certainly in another unrelated inquiry around family law matters, it has been said that some of the alternative dispute resolution processes would absolutely reach out to people who have been who are victims of family and domestic violence. So I would put us all on alert in that matter. As I said at the outset, we just had some concerns around whether or not the other changes put up here would have some unintended consequences relating to a generation of a debt over a matter which the receiving parent would have had absolutely no capacity to have known that that would have been generating a debt, and having spent that money in good faith may be financially disadvantaged. We seek some government assurances that that would not be the case.
Thank you, Member for Newcastle. The question is that the bill